Welcome to the Demystifying Bitcoin track. 12 years into its creation, Bitcoin is just beginning to gain institutional acceptance. To continue to encourage adoption, education is extremely important. And while constructive criticism of Bitcoin is healthy, unfortunately, the mainstream media and influential financial research institutions still dismiss Bitcoin based on stale information and flawed analysis. In this track, we revisit some of Bitcoin's most common misperceptions in the hopes of advancing the discussion and understanding of Bitcoin and the important role it will play in society.
Hello, my name is Nick Carter. I'm a general partner at Castle Island Ventures and the co-founder of Coinmetrics. I'm here to talk about Bitcoin's energy dynamics, why it consumes so much energy, and what we can expect from it in the future as the protocol evolves. This is a very contentious topic, and I think when the facts are considered, it's demystified. We can become much more comfortable with its energy usage. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the first thing, a key premise for this entire discussion is that Bitcoin has a claim on some of the Earth's resources. And so Bitcoin is this global, neutral monetary network. It provides the settlement of value in an apolitical sense without regard for who is using the network. And it transacts tens of billions of dollars a day and stores the wealth of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's used by, we don't know exactly, but 50 to 100 million people worldwide. And so it provides a genuine utility to tens of millions of people. And so this is a key premise for understanding and conceptualizing any of the energy dynamics, because you have to acknowledge the validity of this network to reason about the costs. If you reject the utility of this network, then no cost, no energy outlay is going to be worth it. But this is a key premise, and of course, other speakers today will be talking about this far more in depth, so we won't go into too much. Key premise of the talk, Bitcoin has a claim on some of society's resources, the same way that gold does, for instance. So let's just reset and remind ourselves why Bitcoin consumes any energy at all. So there's really a number of reasons, but there's two primary ones. So the first one has to do with providing settlement assurances, effectively providing to users of the system the assurance that their transaction will settle, will have finality, and will have a single linear history of events in the Bitcoin system. And so the miners incur this cost to create new blocks for the privilege of adding transactions to blocks. And in exchange for that, they get compensated with new units of Bitcoin and fees. And so this energy cost incurred by miners encourages them to behave honestly and to pursue a single linear history of the network, as opposed to branching it into other directions or creating these reorganizations where they change the history of the network. The users of this system, they want to have the assurances that their transactions are going to settle, that they're going to be final, and that nothing's going to be changed after the fact. And so the energy cost that accompanies transactions and that is incurred by the miners, that is what grants users of the system those strong assurances. And of course, as I said, at peak, Bitcoin will process $10 to $20 billion a day in final settlements, and it stores around $600 billion today, although of course that changes on a day-to-day basis. So it's providing a genuine monetary transactional utility in a way that's quite distinct from other transactional systems. Additionally, and this is often overlooked, Bitcoin mining is a system of distributing the new units of Bitcoin to the world at large. And so when Satoshi devised Bitcoin, in 2008 and then created it in 2009, Satoshi had this conundrum. How am I going to actually distribute the units of this commodity to the world at large? Satoshi could have emailed, their friends, new units of Bitcoin, but that wouldn't have exactly been a fair or credible way to initially distribute these units to the world. And so the method that Satoshi settled on was proof of work, where effectively you have to spend energy and computational resources in order to obtain new units of Bitcoin. And so miners themselves, they're not particularly privileged in terms of their access to the monetary issuance, unlike, say, the Federal Reserve is privileged in terms of access to new dollars. For them, it's costless to create the dollars. Because miners have to incur this cost, they have relatively thin margins historically, and so no one is able to extract seigniorage, able to extract a significant rent from their position as the monetary issuer. Instead, it's this very much free market process. And so proof of work solves this decentralized initial issuance problem. And that's a really key thing to remember as we consider its sort of energy outlay. So as I said, Bitcoin's security and reliability derives from proof of work. And so the costliness of the ledger is what links this digital system to the physical world. The fact that there are actual physical costs associated with creating new ledger entries, that links the analog and the digital. And an analogy here you could consider would be Mesopotamian clay tablets, from 3000 BC, where these accounting relationships would be inserted onto wet clay, and X owes Y, Z amounts of barley, for instance, and that relationship is described on the clay tablet, and then it's set outside in the sun to dry. And once the tablet is dried, that relationship is forever encoded. It can't be changed. It can't be reversed. Bitcoin blocks the accumulation of computational work in progressive Bitcoin blocks, gives you a similar kind of assurance. Once a transaction has occurred in the Bitcoin ledger, once sufficient blocks have been mined, that transaction is assumed to be final. And so in the case of the clay tablets, it's the sun's energy which is providing you that kind of finality and calcifying the ledger and effectively making it robust and immutable. In the case of Bitcoin, it's computational work which does that same thing. Now, a lot of people say, well, why can't we just strip the proof of work out of Bitcoin and insert a system like proof of stake? Well, if you were to do that in proof of stake, you would create influence proportional to the number of coins held. In the case of Bitcoin, that would make these large custodians, banks, effectively, that control lots of coins on behalf of users. It would make them the stewards of the network. It would give them effective control. And unfortunately, it's the case today that many, a large fraction of all the outstanding Bitcoins are controlled by these custodians. And so if you were to eliminate the proof of work process and impose something like proof of stake, or delegate control to these third-party validators with a lot of influence, you would lose the nice assurances. You would lose the decentralization of the network effectively. So as far as we know, proof of work provides pretty unique assurances that aren't recaptured by any alternative system. So as I mentioned before, proof of work has a couple different functions. One of them is to mediate the initial issuance of new Bitcoins. And it's interestingly the fact that historically the vast majority of Bitcoin's energy expenditure derives from this issuance. So miners are compensated in two ways. One is through the collection of new units of Bitcoin, and then the second is through fees that users attach to transactions. But historically, the issuance of new units of Bitcoin has dominated their revenue. It's been over 90% of their revenue historically, with transaction fees being much more minor. And so when you think about the energy consumption of the Bitcoin system, this is really critical because you have to decompose transactional intensity from miner revenue and hence energy spend. It's not the case that adding more transactions will dramatically increase the energy expenditure of the Bitcoin network, as a lot of people mistakenly believe. Most of the energy consumption is really a function of the price of Bitcoin and, of course, the value of that new issuance that miners are collecting. That's really what's going to drive the energy consumption over the next few years, not the number of transactions. Bitcoin can scale up the number of transactions or the value of transactions without really having a linear proportional effect on the amount of energy that miners are consuming. So it's really, in the near and medium term, much more a function of the price of Bitcoin and the value of the new reward that miners are incurring. And this is kind of analogous to gold, again. You shouldn't think of Bitcoin's energy dynamics as analogous to something like Visa. You should think of it as similar to gold, where the vast majority of the energy expended by gold production, manufacturing, extraction, has to do with mining the gold, pulling it out of the ground and refining it. It has much less to do with moving the gold on trucks or boats or anything like that. It's kind of similar with Bitcoin. Most of the energy outlay in Bitcoin's case is a function of the initial creation of Bitcoins. And so that's a key thing to remember, because gold is this useful commodity that people use to store their wealth outside the confines of the state. The extraction of gold is kind of tolerated, even if it's not particularly ecological. And same thing with Bitcoin. The production of Bitcoin is, still, yields and provides us with this system, which is of value to society. And so it's still, something that we should accommodate effectively. Now, let's just